The book, if you've noticed, if you've looked at it, even flipped through it, getting it today, probably the first thing that strikes you is actually the organization of the book. Not only is it not chronological, in a way it's not even topical in a normal way that we think of it. It starts off, there are 6 parts. The first is ideas that talk about the war in a large context. And as you know, Victor and his work, obviously all of this is referenced with ancient history throughout the book. And then goes through sort of the functions, the air, water, and earth of how the war was fought. And then fire, and then people, and then finally, what were the ends? So it's immediately a conceptual approach to the war. And the lessons that at least jumped out to me, I wanted to maybe, without a sort of hierarchy of them, but just to get them from you, Victor. The first one that keeps recurring through the book, I think, is this concept of innovation in war. And I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about that and how you saw that playing out through the war, both at the personal level, the technological level, and the like.
Well, you can define innovation by technological innovation, and by that standard, as many of the technological breakthroughs came from the Axis of the Allies, where the war started off with biplanes and ended up with German jets. It started off with a Mark I tank of 6 tons. It ended up with a King Tiger of 70 tons. It ended up with a Mauser rifle from the German army, maybe with a clip 8 bullets a minute. And it ended up with a Sturmgewasser that could shoot, in theory, 1,200 bullets a minute. So there was enormous technological change. And they were largely, not all, there were Katushka rockets on the Soviets, but they were largely American, British, sonar, radar, Manhattan Project, the B-29 project. They were mostly British, American, and German. And I'd like to say that transparent governments and the Allies gave them some advantages, but German science and physics, et cetera, were such at a level that it's hard to make that argument. But the second aspect is the pragmatics of using technology, and here there was a noticeable difference. The American idea and the Russian idea and the British idea was we build as many weapons, because they had a much larger economy, that are serviceable, that can be maintained. So a Sherman tank, maybe 1 hour of operation for 10 hours on the road. A much more impressive King Tiger, just a Tiger 1 hour of operation, maybe requiring 2 hours of maintenance, or maybe even 1 to 1. A rail gun like Gustav, 7,500 people to man it, and yet it only shot 130 projectiles into Sevastopol. Or the price per delivering a pound of explosives in a B-17 versus a V-2 or V-1 was a magnitude of 1 to 100 or 1 to 1,000 even, in terms of cost analysis. So in every aspect of weapons technology, the Allies, and I think this was because they were more transparent, they had more affinities with challenge and response. They took weapons and they looked at the practical side. The battleship was obsolete and dinosaur-like by 1942, given the role of carriers. Remember, with a carrier, you could project power maybe one way 300 and eventually 400 miles. A 16-inch gun might shoot 25 miles. But that didn't mean that battleships were not very valuable in amphibious assaults in the Pacific as mobile artillery. And so we were able to use these battleships, and both that were resurfaced, reused after Pearl Harbor, but the Montana class and the Iowa class were very, very valuable in a way that the Yamamoto, which I think the Yamamoto, they called it Hotel Yamamoto. It was at Rabaul. It was so impractical in terms of fuel. 72,000 tons, 18-inch guns, and the Musashi and the Yamamoto together sank 1 carrier, light carrier. And they were of no practical value. They probably used enough capital and labor to have built 40 or 50 destroyers, which would have been very invaluable to the Japanese. So science and technology is one thing, but the ability to use it in a pragmatic manner was what really helped the Allies. And then sharing things. Italy, not only were there no strategic conversations, and this is odd among the Axis because they were like fascist powers, The Allies were ideologically different: Soviet communism, American democracy, British imperialism. But they collaborated all the time. If American airframe, the P-51, didn't pan out with its Allison engine, the British put a Merlin engine. It became the best fighter in the world. If a Sherman was in Normandy and they discovered, to their horror, that it was not up to even a Mark IV, much less a Panther and Tiger, the British came and said, we can put a 17-pound gun in it and make it a Firefly very cheaply. And there was no cross-fertilization between Japan and Italy and Germany as far as weapons sharing technology. We had a pretty worthless air Cobra P-39. The Russians thought, wow, this is very good air support with a 20 or 30 millimeter gun to bust tanks on the Eastern Front. And Hitler woke up and he said on December 7th, 41, where is Pearl Harbor? Had no idea what the Japanese. He had cut a non-aggression pact in 39 that undermined the Japanese fighting in Manchuria, and the Japanese paid him back in 41 on the eve of Barbarossa in April, doing the same thing. Italy, Mussolini said, I had no idea he was going to invade Soviet Union. Count Ciano said, well, he had no idea you were going into Dalmatia and Greece. And yet, even with a partner like the Soviet Union, Normandy was synchronized, Lend-Lease was synchronized, Anglo-American cooperation was synchronized, and it really paid off in terms of technology.
Can I ask, there's another element of innovation that you bring in, which is during campaigns, learning from mistakes, so that, for example, you talk about the U.S. strategic bombing campaign, and you talk about our amphibious campaigns. And, you know, the first amphibious campaigns were disasters, and operations were disasters, and strategic bombing changed. So there's, but it seems that it was really on the Allied side that you saw that innovation within campaigns, which in some ways is odd. We think of ourselves as an innovative people, but you also think that, you know, democracies are slower to try to come to this change point. Everybody has to sort of get heard, whereas you would think that the totalitarians would be better. You know, the lesson is learned and immediately everyone's told to shift left. So how did you see that playing a role as well?
Well, I think in the terms of the more autocratic society, the more top-down decision making. So Hitler would have ended, if Hitler had been in charge, he would have ended the strategic bombing campaign when it started suffering 10 to 15% losses by 1940, late 42. It was a failure, 40,000 B-17 crewmen. But there were people in the crews and squadron commanders that said, we have improved B-17s. We can, there's theories about drop tanks that can extend the range of a P-51. We are going to occupy France and deny the forward fields for the Luftwaffe. And we are going to redirect from precision bombing. The British were right about area bombing, and start looking at rail yards and synthetic fuel plants. And the point I'm making is that second phase, they were pretty effective. And in the third phase, when somebody like Jimmy Doolittle says, well, why would we have P-51s escorting B-17s when we got 18-year-olds behind the controls of the best fighter in the world? Let them just go out and hunt. And so they would, you know, literally just be up in the air waiting for a one Focke-Wulf to take off, or even a ME-262. So there was all of this innovation and decentralized decision-making that was not to the same degree true. And Hitler said, we're going to have a V-2 program, we're going to have V-1, and people complained and said, you're sucking resources out of fighter planes. Or if you build these big rail guns, or you build the V-1, we're not going to have enough 88 millimeters, and you're going to take them all back to protect the cities. They were the only thing that really worked against the T-34 in the Eastern Front. So it was not a flexible, bottoms-up challenge and response cycle. To the degree that the Allies were. And I think just having two transparent societies and an alliance of three rubbed off on the Soviet Union, because Stalin, unlike Hitler, began to trust his generals. He started out like Hitler, and Hitler got more and more inclusive in his own small circle, and ignored the advice. But Stalin became more like us than we became like him, as evil as he was. And it was very different, the approach.
Let me shift now, again, just to move through, because we don't have that much time before we move to questions. Second big lesson that I think jumps out of the book, and you reiterated at different points, is the question of strategy, just actual, top-level strategy. It comes out when you talk about Supreme Command, obviously when you talk about the warlords, but earlier in the book as well. It's stunning the way that you point out the just almost basic, fundamental strategic mistakes that the Axis make from the very beginning of the war going forward. And yet the Allies, who are perceived really not to initially have much of a strategy, by the end are very clear. How that dynamic, was it something that had surprised you at all to see and to sort of overturn, the images that we had of, a sort of very clear German view and a very clear Japanese view of what they wanted to do?
I think a lot of it originated from two strategists that were entirely incompetent. And one was Adolf Hitler, that had been warped by his experience in World War I at a ground view level. And he kept thinking, equating the superiority of the German army in border wars, and he waged 9 of them, remember, in Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, France, Yugoslavia, and he won them all. And he, by extension, thought that an army that was 80% powered by horses could extend blitzkrieg to the Eastern Front, 1,500 miles to the Volga, with no ability to hit half of Russian industry on the other side of the Urals. So he equated the idea of border wars with existential war. And when you fight an existential war, you have to be able to destroy Detroit or Manchester or the Urals. And he had no 4-engine bomber, never built one that worked. He had no aircraft carrier. He had no ability to project force. And he kept saying, well, I'm not going to be blockaded like in World War I. I'll take the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union was not France. And the Russian people could lose 7 million and keep fighting in a way that 250,000 knocked France out of the war. And Yamamoto was the same way. When he looked at the strategic situation, the Army actually, Mr. Blinkard Tojo had much better strategic sense, I think, than Yamamoto. The Army had said, we have 1 million people in China, and it looks like Hitler is going to win. Late November, he's finally got Army Group South and Center straightened out, and we're on our way to Moscow, and they're nearing the first subway station. But we're not going to invade Russia. We fought them in '39, and we're not going to invade from the east, and this non-aggression pact is tit for tat. They did it to us in '39 and pulled the rug from under us, and we did it to them. This is the Japanese speaking. And at that point, the Navy said, well, we're the only branch of the service that has Western parity. Our ships are comparable, our planes are comparable, you don't have tanks, so we're going to really take over the war. And the Army said, well, I'm paraphrasing a number of views, we're not really sure the Germans are going to win, because if we don't attack, they're going to send 20 or 30 divisions from Siberia that will arrive in Moscow. But more importantly, if this is now a naval war, we're bogged down in China, and we've got these occupations planned of what was the Dutch East Indies, Southeast Asia, and we have to be very careful. So why don't you take these orphan countries, and you'll get all the oil you want from Shell Oil, and you'll get all the food you want from Southeast Asia. You'll get all the, even attack Britain, but just skip the Philippines and the United States. And that was something that Yamamoto threatened to resign. And yet he had no ability to hit Detroit or Portland or San Francisco. So how in the world was he going to win the war? He had some 9 nice fleet carriers. He had not one single 4-engine bomber. Italy didn't build one. Germany didn't build one. Germany didn't build a carrier. Italy didn't build a carrier. And it taxed all of the limits of Japanese ingenuity. It was a brilliant campaign to get those 6 carriers all the way 3,000 miles off the coast of Pearl Harbor in the middle of winter, refueling at sea under radio silence. But that was about the extent of the Japanese imperial capability. And they were not able to attack the sources of American power, whereas the Allies, as soon as after the Casablanca, and they started synchronizing, it was to end this war, we're going to go to Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo and destroy their ability not just to make war, but their ability to function as a civilization. and we have the aircraft and the mobility at sea and air, and we have the Red Army. We can do this. Very different attitude. They didn't live in a world of fantasy and myth that a German soldier kills 7 Red Army soldiers, and so what if Berlin's being bombed? So,
when you talk about Japan in the war, certainly from hindsight, it seems an insane suicidal gamble. Country that has no natural resources and has all the limitations. And that, I think you bring out in so many ways with each of the protagonists and antagonists when you talk about what is in essence the question of national power.
yeah.
Compared to Japan, for example, I would say almost, I don't know if sympathetic's the right word, but the Soviet Union comes off really much better in your telling than I expected.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, Stalin himself does, but the Soviets do. The fact that they're turning out more and better quality materiel than the Germans and then almost anyone else by the end of the war, which is again not something that is the normal story. But this, when you look back at the beginning and sort of link to the strategy question, the beginning of the war. And I think you draw out, you're very blunt about the fact that the national leaders made these terrible calculations about what weight their national power could actually bear in this type of war. And maybe it was a miscalculation because Hitler thought it was border wars. The Japanese thought the Americans would sue for peace. But can you talk a little bit about that element of national power? You talk about the home front, you talk about all of it. And how that played into this question of the war's development.
Yeah. Well, there were 4 key decisions in the war, and they were all, with the benefit of our hindsight, wrong. The first was, why in the world did Hitler declare war and get himself into war? He was declared war on by the British Empire. So nothing could stop in 1939 the German army. And as soon as he cut a deal with Stalin was more than happy to on August 23rd, 1939, because he thought these deviant capitalist countries, National Socialism and the democracies would wear each other out, and we'd have psalm after psalm after psalm. He never in his right mind thought that France would be knocked out in 6 weeks, the indomitable French army of World War I. But once he got into war, people in OKW, the general staff of the Wehrmacht, started to ask Hitler very quickly, well, how do you intend to knock Britain out of the war? He said, well, we have all of Europe, what is now the EU. We have Norway to the Sahara. We have the English Channel to the Russian border. They'll have to quit. And people would say, what if they don't quit? They have the resources of the British Empire. They have Iraqi oil. They have Australian mutton. They have Canadian trucks. And we don't have a surface fleet. And he said, well, the U-boat, mein Führer, you went to war with 52 U-boats. And we have no lift capacity, we have no air power that can go in and destroy the industrial might of Britain. In the worst days of the Blitz, Spitfire production exceeded that of the Calm in Europe, of Bf-109 production. It's just amazing. And Hitler had no idea what to do with the British. That was the first one. And when he went in the Soviet Union, he had no idea how to make that country. He thought that if you killed X number of people, they would quit. There was no historical evidence that Russia ever did that. There was no historical evidence that anybody, whether it was Charles the 11th or Napoleon, could wait until the mud dried out and get there before the snow fell and destroy that country. 180 million people. And nobody had ever thought, and you declared war in the United States in December 11th. Germany did when there was no need to. We wouldn't have fought the Germans. We would have fought the Japanese. What we did, and people had said to Hitler, there were very astute people in the Wehrmacht, and they said, this is a country that landed 2 million people in World War I, just in 17 months. They didn't lose one transporting them. Once they geared up, they were making more artillery shells than French and British production together, and we declared war on them for what? And Hitler said, well, Admiral Raeder and Donetsk said that we have now the East Coast, that we can hit our U-boats and stop and strangle. And he had such an inordinate respect for sea power, given his impotence in it, that we have the Italian Navy now will be dominant in the Mediterranean, and the Japanese Navy has parity with the American Navy, and they'll have to take their assets over, and Japan will tie them down, and we will starve Britain. It was all in a world of fantasy. And of course, the other decision with Japan attacking at Pearl Harbor and attacking Singapore and Malaysia, getting those two powers in. And that was a disaster. Again, based on this fantasy idea that given Russian collusion in the past, given British appeasement, given American isolationism, these people would not want to fight an existential war. And, you know, I think one lesson from the war is we have this ethnocentric idea, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's with China, that the more people come over here, the more that they appreciate the complexity, the diversity, the richness of American country, and the more they're impressed and the more they love Americans. That's true in some cases, but a lot of people have an opposite. We saw that in 9/11. So when Foreign Minister Mitsuka grew up, as you know, in Portland, and even Tojo took a train ride across the United States, and Yamamoto as an attaché, they came back with exactly the opposite conclusion. They're frivolous, they wear spats, they drive fast cars, they're isolationists, they let London burn, they're not to be taken seriously. They're just not engaged in the world. And we didn't expect that. So we lost incrementally and insidiously the sense of deterrence. Even though, you know, we were second largest, we had a larger Navy, Atlantic Pacific, than the Japanese did, and we had another one that was larger than all navies in the world put together by 1944. And yet Japan thought there is a particular, throughout history, a particular contempt aggressors have for stronger powers who are materially impressive, but they get the wrong impression, they won't use it. I think that's part of the problem in North Korea. They don't really know that we're that much powerful. They have an idea, but they have contempt for us because they think that that power is somehow not to be used or it's predictably, and that can be fatal.
I'd like to dig a little bit more before we move to questions on the United States.
Yes.
First, throughout the book, you know, the insights and the comparisons you make are just unendingly rich. But particularly on the United States, you draw out a lot of things that are fascinating. One that I remember that jumped out at me is you have a little paragraph in there where you talk about when the Americans went to war. It was a unique generation. It was the first generation that had grown up with motor cars, and everyone was a mechanic. And in fact, I think you have a quote from one of the generals. You know, you could send the Americans out there. And they could fix the things. They could sort of propel themselves forward, but they were also men from the cities. They were men from the countryside. There was this incredible mix that was able to very well be sort of self-sustaining. But you have a fascinating quote when you talk about how it was the home front that developed, the unbeatable industrial production during the war. In the chapter on soldiers and armies, you have a quote that, quote, "the system rather than the man was what would win the war." Yeah. It's on page 218. And it struck me as an ironic quote, given that we focus so much on the individualism, the myth of American individualism, Audie Murphy and the like. But you talk about is actually the system, which is what we would have thought you might have said about Germany, you might have said about the Soviet Union, but you said it was the Americans.
Well, I meant that system of free market capitalism. Mm-hmm. So we basically, a neo-socialist government turned over the war to men like William Knudsen at GM and Henry Kaiser and Henry Ford, and they were allowed to make a profit. And they did things that are inconceivable. I mean, just destroying parts of Hayward or Willow Run, Michigan, and turning out a B-24 one an hour, or a Liberty ship every 48 hours. And there were levels of production that, when they were presented by intelligence to the Japanese and the Germans, they just didn't believe them. Or creating a GDP by 1945 that was larger than all five belligerents put together, Allied and Axis. Or building 450,000 of the 600,000 airframes, or providing 90% of all the aviation fuel in the war. Think of that. And that gave us enormous advantage over training. And yet we only had a population of 135 million. The population of Japan was about 75 and Germany was about 80. They had combined had a larger population than we did. But they occupied territory, remember, by 1942, from the English Channel to the Volga River and from the Arctic Circle in Norway to the Sahara Desert, and larger in the case of the greater Asia, East Asia prosperity sphere, from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Aleutians and from Manchuria to Wake Island. So the problem wasn't resources or manpower, it was organization and transparency and profit motive. And Germany, for all of Albert Speer's supposed brilliance, he didn't have an ounce of the savvy that William Knudsen did or Henry Kaiser did. Just didn't do it.
You mentioned as well that of all the belligerents, only the U.S. was a completely or exclusively, I think you said, exclusively an expeditionary force.
Yeah.
And so we invested in air and sea power, an overemphasis, not overemphasis, but extraordinary emphasis on logistics, mobility, which offset the fact that we did not put nearly as many combat men under arms. Part of that, and what you talk about, and it's part of this question of innovation, is that unlike how we do it today, we went smaller and lighter.
Yes.
You make a lot about talking about escort carriers, the destroyers, fighter planes, not the B-29, which you said the most expensive and biggest, most lethal weapon system of the war, but so much else was light and small and mobile. Yes. Is it something that we're not in, obviously, a comparable situation in any way today, but when did we lose that sense that this was the route to go, that this is what gave you so much flexibility? And today we're in a very different way where we build monstrous machines, almost like the Germans and
I think it happened toward the end of the Cold War when the Soviets started producing massive missiles and megaton, and we tried to match them, and then we thought we got into this mindless competition, but we valued an airplane by how fast it could go, not how much it cost. So ironically, gigantism is the plague of every autocracy, whether it's Demetrius and his siege machine at the Siege of Rhodes, but the Axis suffered from what we're suffering now. They built rail guns, they built the Yamato, the Musashi, the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, and these were not practical weapon systems. King Tiger II was worthless. They had a Mouse Tiger on a Mark 8 that was supposed to be 200-ton tank. Can you imagine that? And yet we built lightweight, 30-ton, medium Sherman tanks, very easy to maintain. We adapted them. We put a Rhino blades if we had to go through hedgerows. We put a British 17-pounder if we wanted to take out a Tiger. I think we're getting back to that idea of decentralized escort. 142 carriers we built. Only 27 of them were fleet carriers. There were escort and light carriers. For about a half the price, we could put the same plane in the sky. And think of the American ingenuity. So we have these first generation of fighters, Wildcats, and we have these SBDs, and all of a sudden we build a whole new generation of Hellcats and Corsairs we give the British, and we have the Hell Divers and the Avenger, and then we have all these planes we made, so we just put them on the escort and light carrier, and they're pretty good, parity with the Japanese, once we have the fleet carriers with the good stuff. So we were so practical about using stuff, and I think maybe with our emphasis now on lightweight drones, lots of drones, thousands of them flooding a zone, or we're talking now about escort carriers maybe in the future, this idea we're getting back to decentralization is going to be wise. But I really, when I see three big battle groups they're very impressive right now in the Pacific, I'm thinking to myself, if we get in a war with China, are they going to unload 5,000 2-foot-long missiles 16 inches above the ground at night to go right through them? And are they going to take down a $180 million plane? And how many can we lose when they do that? And if we are afraid they're going to do that, we're going to be risk aversive. So I think we got to get back to that idea of World War II.
In a half an hour we can barely scratch the surface of all of the things that you discussed, though I'm glad we got to this sort of question about the parallels in some ways between what we're doing today and what the Axis did, and then how we might be going back. But we do want to open it up for a discussion. So we have mics. If you can let us know who you are and just ask a question, appreciate it. So first one, yes.
Sebastian Gorka.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
And I look forward to reading the book. Clearly, World War II is just a case study in the difference between good strategy and bad strategy. Would you be so kind as to grade America since 1989, give us a strategic grade, and to explain the grade you give us?
And I think you picked 1989 as the fall of the Cold War. And so we were what the French called the single hyperpower. And the pluses of it are that we included over that period of the last 30 years, about 40 or 50 million, 60 million, maybe even 200 or 300 million more into the global system. So today, we can call Africa, we can take a plane to Bolivia, there's antibiotics under globalization. As somebody who lost his a ruptured appendix in Libya, I'm alive today because Gaddafi had some taste of globalization, and I had my ruptured appendix. So that was a plus. But we got into these optional wars, some of which I supported, some of which I didn't, some of you did, some of you didn't, where we didn't ask fundamental classical questions. What is the mission? What is the agenda? What are the proposed end of it? And I think the Colin Powell critique was not right because he called it the pottery barn. You own it, you break it. That wasn't the right question. It was, what do you want Libya to look like? What do you want Iraq to look like? What do you want Afghanistan to look like? What means are you willing to invest to achieve that goal? And how are you going to get public support for it? And we didn't ask those questions. And not that we haven't done pretty well with radical Islamic terrorism. I mean, we haven't had another 9/11. We've been pretty good at putting things down. We've made a series of colossal mistakes when we call ISIS JV abruptly pulling out of Iraq, reminding me of Matthew Ridgway's adage, the only worst thing of a bad war is to lose a bad war. And so I think we're pretty much on the idea that we've tried neoconservative nation building, and we've tried apologetics the last 8 years. And I think now I do like the term principled realism. And we don't have good or bad choices, we have bad or worse choices. And yet we're not so naive to think that Jacksonian means you just go and bomb somebody and you don't have to have a base, or you don't have to have a relationship with a foreign power or an ally. And one of the things I like about our policy, meaning American policy, is that we don't get credit for some of the things we do. There's about 9 or 10 really impressive countries in the world that are very weak. So Israel is surrounded by a sea of hostile powers in the Arab world. The Kurds are different than the Arab world. They wouldn't survive without us. They're very impressive, I think, people. They deserve our support. Armenia was the first Christian nation. It's in a sea of hostile neighbors. So is Greece. For all Greece's ankle biting of the United States, if we weren't there and they weren't in NATO, there's about 70 overflights of Greek airspace a month. Turkey is now a neo-Ottoman power on their way, at least I hope not, but there's a fight for the soul of Turkey going on within Turkey. There wouldn't be a Taiwan without the United States. It was created by the United States. There wouldn't be a South Korea without the United States. And so in a very insidious way, we protect a lot of really noble experiments. Everything from Kia to Samsung exists because of us, and yet we don't get much credit. And I don't want to say that that's a waste or a waste of material to be the world's policeman, but I think the better way to look at it is we have certain interests and we have to protect our friends. And as Jim Mattis, who always seems to quote, I think correctly so, although it's a bad guy, the dictator Sulla, no better friend, no worse enemy. It's a quote out of Plutarch's Life of Sulla. And I think we're sort of coalesced back to principled realism. We can't save the world. We're only confronted with bad and worse choices. We see a General Sisi, we're not going to give him a lecture about you should have elections one time and get back the Muslim Brotherhood and give another Cairo speech. But on the other hand, General Sisi, we can't support all the stuff you're doing, but we have some common interest. Same thing with Putin. I think he's an autocratic, dangerous person with blood on his hands, but Russia has got the second largest number of nuclear weapons in the world, and we're forfeiting an ability to triangulate with them as we did in the past, vis-a-vis China or other things that we might have mutual interest. That doesn't mean that we approve of what Russia does internally, but one of the worst things in history is to talk loudly about human rights or lecture than carry a twig. It's much better to be quiet and carry a stick. So, yeah.
And conversely, can you grade the Americans in World War II? I mean, you're actually critical of a lot of early strategic thought. The British reined us in certain good ways. So how would you grade the Americans in World War II?
The thing about the Americans was they learned so quickly. So they had these crazy ideas they were going to invade Europe in 1942 without air or naval superiority, land on. And the British, who were traumatized by the Somme and Passchendaele, said, you know, you can't do that. And here's why. And we learned. And they said, okay, how about 43? And then finally the British said, now wait a minute. We've got 700 Soviet divisions, and they're destroying 2 out of 3 German soldiers. And why would you want to stop that? That's good. And so we can fight in a way that Soviets can't. We can supply them, but we can go around the periphery. North Africa, Sicily, we can have learning experience. And as we got to do that, we start to enjoy. Then we were able to tell the British, nobody has ever gone up the spine of Italy from Sicily. This is stupid. Yet the British were wrong about that. There is no soft underbelly. Do not go into the Dodecanese and roads. That's a bywater. So and then when the B-29, the most expensive weapons project in the world, beautiful bomber, 25,000 individual parts in the nose cone alone. Much more expensive than the Manhattan Project. 25,000 feet and above. Even the advanced post-zero fighters couldn't reach it. In theory, it could carry 10 tons of explosive, but it heated up the Allison engines. They couldn't fly from China to India because they were fuel hungry. They had to be supplied by the ocean. We put them in the Marianas, 1,600 miles one way and back. And precision bombing, when the jet stream could go 200 miles an hour, it had 0 results. And what does LeMay do? He said, this is the world's greatest dive bomber. And the people were aghast. Well, it's a pressurized bomber. We've spent $1 billion to pressurize the cabin. It doesn't matter. We'll fill the whole thing full of napalm. We'll go down at 6,000 feet. We'll say we're precision bombing, but basically the British were right about area bombing. We'll use napalm, and we'll burn these cities down. They're made of wood. And it was frighteningly successful. And yet it was just no other Air Force would have made that radical. And the people who designed it at Boeing were shocked. Well, you should have told us you wanted a low-level dive bomber, and we would have made one. But it turned out to be the best one of the war. And so whether it was, there was just some brilliant things. I mean, in the Pacific, we didn't work well at all with the British like we did in Europe because they had colonial interest. And basically we found out, well, they really want to protect India and not go to Tokyo. So let them have Burma and protect the shoulder of India, and we will go to Tokyo. And they will do a lot of damage to the Japanese and open up a corridor and supply China. That's great. And then we had another problem. We had MacArthur's ego, and he had this plan to go through New Guinea and go into Philippines and Nimitz, and the Marines wanted to go straight into Tokyo. And so, in typical American fashion, let's build enough carriers and draft enough people, 12.3 million people out of a country over 135 million, much more impressive even than the Soviet Union. And we did both. I don't think we should have done both, but it worked. And so we had this ability to improvise. And the other thing about Americans in the war, we were very self-righteous and we were very deadly. Because once we were convinced that we had been wronged, I'll give you one anecdote. So it came up, I'll be very careful because I think you enjoy it. So the debate about the atomic bomb is the left says we only use it to show Stalin our power and to kill yellow people. Asians, and it was racist and it was geostrategic tomfoolery. And traditionalists on the right say, no, it avoided an Okinawa-like invasion at the 10th degree, and we would have lost 1 million people based on the casualty rates at Okinawa. I think the real reason it was good that we dropped them, not why we dropped them, but why it was good that we dropped them, because it saved millions of lives. Mostly Japanese, because Curtis LeMay was probably the genius of the American war. Of all the commanders, he's right up there with Patton and others. And he said, if you give me Okinawa, and now we've secured it on July 2nd, I can have a mission per day, not going 1,600 miles, but 400 miles. And I have 2,000 more B-29s on order. We can put them on Okinawa. And by the way, what have these B-17s and B-24s been doing since the European theater ended? They're just sitting over there. And the British said, well, we have 5,000 Lancasters. And then people started saying, well, we have 5,000 25s and 26 two-engine. They're fine to go to Okinawa. When you start to see what the communications were, that this man was thinking of 10 to 15,000 bombers with napalm, flying every day over Japan that already had suffered 65% of its urban center burned out. And so had you unleashed LeMay in August, September, October, November, I don't think you would have invaded, but we would have killed so many Japanese before it would have been not as dramatic as the atomic bombs. And later after the war, a lot of Japanese officials said that the fire raids and the fear of much greater fire rage was the reason they conceded. So the atomic bomb really, and LeMay objected to the use. Self-servingly, he said, I could have won the war. I would have been tried as a war criminal if we lost, but I could have won the war. And he was probably right about that.
We have other questions in the back.
So one of the things that you've emphasized is American ingenuity, the ability to adapt pre-existing technology, put it to different uses like you just described with the bombers. Does our present acquisition strategy dampen that sort of innovative impulse in the American armed forces today?
It's hard to know if it's a strategy or it's the complexity of technology, but I think it's endemic in the American. I'm not saying that Americans out in the wilds of Afghanistan or during the Iraq War didn't innovate like World War II. So if they see a Sherman tank, they can't get through the hedgerow, somebody, starts to weld obstacles that the Germans put on the beaches and turns them into rhino teeth, and they dig it out, and everybody says, wow, let the sergeants do it if that's what they're going to do. I think that spirit is still there more in our military than other militaries. But you're right that as we become more technological and less manpower, then there's all of these legal protocols, technological protocols that are designed. We're in a challenge and response phase where we're interested more in defense than offense because of the price of a human life has gone up. And so we're spending a lot of money on body armor, protecting the soldier, expensive air support, calling in lawyers and stuff, and that dampens the human imagination for war. One of the things that is kind of strange is under the laws of deterrence, going back to classical antiquity, central to it was disproportionality. Don't dare do this because we are unpredictable and we're going to reply in a way that's overwhelmingly disproportionate in the way that the Israelis say do. But what would encourage an aggressor to do something stupid would be to ensure that you believed in proportionality. So if you attack Portland, don't worry, we'll just attack Pyongyang, but nothing else. And the old idea was, if you dare attack Pearl Harbor, you're going to have an existential war, we're going to burn down Tokyo. But we didn't communicate that. And once we started to communicate that in the Cold War, we had a relative peace. So I think in some ways we've got to go back to, human nature doesn't change, and we shouldn't be fooled by technology that it has. And we can learn a lot from World War II, but the enemy of deterrence is proportionality. You have to be a little bit unpredictable and disproportionate if you want to keep the peace.
Yeah, I'm a retired historian. I used to work for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I've had a theory for many years that you started to say something about we are self-righteous and deadly. And I've had a theory for many years that the reason we haven't really won a war since World War II is because the atomic bomb scared American leadership as much as it scared everyone else. And they have been afraid to unleash the righteous anger of the American people ever since. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to see if you cared to comment on that.
I think that's mostly true, but again,
in relation to the deterrence issue.
Yes. I mean, there were areas in the Afghan war or the Iraq war where we could have applied a greater level of force to defeat, humiliate. You can't reconstruct a country unless they're defeated and they know they're defeated and they have only one alternative. But besides the nuclear fear, in a postmodern society, we knew that as soon as we had toppled the statue of Saddam Hussein, the next scene was going to be Christiane Amanpour with a little girl after a bomb strike and said, we did this, and it's going to be flashed all over the United States. And so we were worried about our self-image, that we killed innocent people. Our prior generation said it's either them or us. So partly we haven't found ourselves in an existential war. We did a little bit after 9/11. But believe me, if North Korea, God help us, were to send a missile into Portland, the most progressive therapeutic minds in Washington are going to okay a retaliatory strike, because they feel if they don't do that, we don't have a civilization. So part of it is these are optional wars that we feel we have a margin of error, that we can lose, we can screw up Libya, we can lose in Afghanistan, it's going to be somebody else who dies. But once we get to the existential level, then you'll be surprised how this therapeutic veneer gets peeled off.
My name is Mindy Cutler from Asia Policy Point. I work on Japan, like Misha. One of the questions of the early months of World War II that's always debated, a year prior to the war, it was decided that there would be a Europe first strategy.
Yeah.
That Asia would be abandoned. And so the guys on Wake and China and Guam and Philippines were left behind. Where do you come down on that? Was that a sensible decision?
As a historian, I always look at what policy and rhetoric say and what actually happened. So when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt didn't, he prayed that Germany would declare war on us because he knew the Americans would not declare war on Germany. How could you ask the Americans to attack somebody who hadn't attacked us and not really fight somebody who had? So after they did declare war, the quandary was, okay, America, Japan attacked us, but they're going to be the secondary target, and the people who did not attack us because they represent a greater existential threat are the primary. And that's what we said. Practically, when you start to look at actual statistics, it's not 70, 30, 80, 20. It's more like 55, 45. For example, they were able to have they had no idea what they were capable of doing. Nobody thought they could turn out a bomber an hour, or they could build another 11 battleships or 27 fleet carriers. So they decided that fleet carriers, most aircraft carriers, 90% of aircraft carriers went to the Pacific. All 6 crack Marine divisions went to the Pacific. 20 of the best Army divisions went to the Pacific. Sherman tanks were used sometimes but not much armor. So if you start to look at artillery and armor, and you start to look at certain types of aircraft, they didn't use Corsairs or Hellcats for a variety of reasons in the European. They only later used Thunderbolts and P-51s at Iwo Jima. So they were able to bifurcate the war effort, and why they said to Britain, this is Europe first. If you actually look at the resources, it was much closer than we thought. And
But not the first 6 months.
what?
Not the first 6 months.
Not the first 6 months. And that was because we didn't have any resources. The U.S. Army started the war behind the 19th Army in the world, Portugal. And so, of course, we sent more. The invasion of North Africa siphoned all of our resources out. But after Midway and after the Carl Vinson building program kicked in, we had as I said, by 1944, our fleet was bigger than all the fleets in the world. So you could divide it any way you wanted, but whoever was on the 45% end was still going to be bigger than anybody else put together. The other thing, I think, to remember something about the Pacific, if we looked at the war just in terms of casualties, it was the first war where there were more dead civilians than soldiers, first major war. There was the first major war in which, besides the Civil War, the winners lost far more than the losers. And of the 65 million that were killed, about 80% were out of uniform and unarmed, and they were killed by German and Japanese soldiers. So one way to reduce the war was, somebody asked me the other day, what was World War II about? And I said it was about Japanese and Germans butchering people who couldn't fight back in Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, and China. Altogether about 48, 50 million people. So a lot, and yet 12.3 million, we lost 0.03 of our own. And yet we were fighting people that killed 50 million people. And that was what the war was about. It was us trying to stop Germans and Japanese from killing innocent people. And that's what we might not articulate it that way, but that's what happened. They had no ability to kill us here in the United States. They did not have ability to kill the British, but they had the ability to kill millions of people, and they did. I have a less sympathy for the Japanese soldier and the German soldier in the sense that If you look at the actual number of civilians that died in Japan versus the number of people were killed by the Japanese, it's just overwhelmingly disproportionate, that bad word. And in the case of Germany, Germans say we had our own Holocaust. 13 million people were ethnically cleansed. 2 million died. It was a tragedy. But compared to 27 million people in the Soviet Union, they killed. So it was a worst catastrophe in human history, much more than the Black Plague or the Great Famines in Russia. 65 million people were killed because of Russian collusion, American isolationism, and British appeasement. And basically,
I think you give the statistic, it's 3% of the global population
Yes.
in those 6 years.
yeah, and you think it was 1 billion people were involved in the war. And so what was the war all about? The war was all about, hey, Axis power, it's very stupid to attack the Soviet Union, the United States of America, and the British Empire. But it took 65 million people to prove what we should have known from the beginning. And we didn't know from the beginning because the Russians had colluded, the British had appeased, and the Americans were isolationists and had given a false message to the Japanese and the Germans that their unhinged ideas of Untermenschen and Übermenschen and Yamato and Raza in Italy meant something. It meant nothing. It meant nothing compared to what the United States could do and what the Soviet Union and what British could do. And yet that's what war is. It's basically a laboratory. Every war is a laboratory where it corrects wrong impressions on the eve of war. And so what you want to do to prevent a war is to tell everybody in the room, these people have these assets. Don't do something and be stupid, because in a cost-benefit analysis, you're going to lose, and you're going to have a war to prove what we told you. So it's incumbent upon the targeted people, us all, usually, to apprise people of the dangers that they're incurring. And we didn't do that in World War II. So after everybody shrugged and said, well, 65 million dead, but we knew what we knew in 1939. That seems to be a tragedy.
Or there was a lot of like strategic just mistakes. You had to think of like Anzio, where we invaded and didn't come of anything. Allies were bogged down in Normandy for 6 weeks in the hedgerows. Battle of the Bulge, I think the Allies had 80,000 casualties because of basically a massive intelligence failure on the part of Eisenhower. But the American people really didn't know that much about that, at least not till after the war. Could we have won the war if we had the instant communication that we have today, when they see day to day all of the mistakes that were going on throughout the war?
I think we could have. It would have been more difficult. After all, Life magazine published The Beach at Tarawa, and people were shocked that the Marines were rotting on the beach. That was a screwed up operation that we really didn't know what we were doing. It would have been much more difficult. All wars, if you look at the number of generals that Lincoln went through before he got to Grant and Sherman. So we had a problem with pre-war. Friedenhall in North Africa was an alcoholic incompetent. And I revere the memory of Omar Bradley, but he wasn't up to the job. Courtney Hodges was not up to the job. John Lucas was not up to the job. Clark was not up to the job. What saved us was that 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, people like Matthew Ridgway or Jim Gavin or those corps and division commanders were excellent. They came out of West Point and post-BA Army schools, infantry school, Fort Leavenworth. They were excellent, but it took us time to get to them. And it took us time to get Major LeMay to General LeMay. And it took us time to see that maybe Ira Eaker wasn't the great genius that we thought. And that happens in war. But we were very quick in getting the right people there. If I could criticize the American system, there was a little bit of too much emphasis on status quo and how you looked as a general and whether you were a consensus builder. And most of the time, the people who saved us were eccentric, obnoxious, who were failures in peace and would be eccentric failures after the war if they survived. I'm talking particularly a guy like Matthew Ridgway, who was very much disliked, but an absolute military genius. Curtis LeMay was a genius. I mean, he was the source of 2 characters in Dr. Strangelove. And George Patton was ridiculed. Nobody, if I said to people that George Patton spoke French, read German, tried to learn Latin, was very educated, they wouldn't believe it. If I said that Omar Bradley really was not very educated, was not very, they wouldn't believe it. He was the GI general with a very plush trailer, and Patton was flying a Piper Cub by himself. But so we had this image of Americanism that sometimes hindered merit, and we really paid a terrible price. You mentioned ANZA. There's no way in the world that John Lucas should have ever been in charge at that level, or Courtney Hodges. The Hurtgen Forest was a disaster. The Bulge was a disaster. Not closing the Falaise Gap was a disaster. And all of those decisions were either Bradley or Hodges, somewhat Montgomery, but also Eisenhower, who did a lot of wonderful things, but strategy and tactical operational genius wasn't what he was there for.
I think we may have time for one more, though that was a really great summation. If we have one more excellent question that can top the last question.
Doesn't have to be excellent.
If anyone has a last question. Did you have one, sir?
Yeah.
Yes.
Roosevelt, Stalin, and Yalta, and the sort of post-Cold War critique of you know the issue I'm talking about.
Yes. Well, the post-Cold War critique is that as a neo-socialist Democrat and surrounded by people like Harry Hopkins and Alger Hiss, et cetera, and with blood pressure of 180 over 200, probably suffering from chronic urinary infections, sinus infections, melanomas, and to be dead in 4 months, Roosevelt was not up to dealing with Stalin, and he was naive about Soviet intentions, and he deliberately triangulated in a very mean way toward Churchill because he saw the world, both the post-war world as the Soviet Union and the United States as two superpowers, and he wasn't really convinced that British imperialism was that much better than Soviet communism, which is a fatal mistake. That said, in retrospect, when you have 500 divisions posted going into Eastern Europe, and you have 100 divisions in the West, it's really hard to know. Had he stood up to Stalin, and he said, "You're going to have free elections in Poland. We're going to hold you to honoring your commitments in Hungary and Romania and Finland." It's hard to know what he did. Whereas Churchill said, I don't have anything to work with. I don't trust the SOB, so I'm going to sell out Poland and try to save Austria, make Austria and Finland non-NATO neutral countries, and then really get my hands on save Greece and Turkey. And that was considered horse trading by the Americans. They were very naive in their assessment of Stalin, but whether it would have made any difference given the disproportionate power in the East, it's hard to know. And again, we went to war for 3 reasons: to destroy Japanese militarism, Italian fascism, and German Nazism, and we did that. And then we went to war to create a post-war order that allowed freedom of expression, communications, travel, and we more or less did that because we turned right around and stopped the Soviet Union. When I look back at it, boy, we had a terrible propaganda that they used against us from 46 on. I don't know how we did it, because if you remember what the Russians and the Chinese were saying to people in Burma, to people in Korea, to people in Vietnam, to people in Europe, we wish that the Allies had continued the noble struggle against fascism, but what have they done? They joined the Axis. Now they're hand in league with the Germans. They're hand in league with the Japanese. They're hand in league with the Italians. Us, we're still liberating people in the spirit of World War II. That's a difficult propaganda to counteract, especially when Germany is destroyed and you've got to bring out of the closet people like General Halder, or you're dealing with Werner von Braun or somebody. You're dealing with Nazis to protect them from losing Germany, and the same thing in Japan. So we had a very difficult propaganda, and yet we pulled it off. And I'm just amazed at sort of this Germany down, Russia out, America in, to create the post-war world, and it really worked. As I did an interview with a German journalist the other day, and he said, well, we all believe that Russia out, you did that pretty well in the Cold War, and you stayed in, but what was the deal about Germany down? And I said, well, I got back from Greece 2 years ago, and they call you people Gautleiters because you're a mercantile economy that are bankrupt southern Mediterranean. I just got back from Eastern Europe, and they say that you've ruined Europe because of your dictatorial immigration policies. I just got back from Britain, and they say that you're holding them up over Brexit. So I don't think that your popularity, I just looked at the Pew poll, of the 22 European countries, you're by far the most anti-American. 52% of Germans approve of America. I mean, you look at Hungary or Poland or Italy, it's 65, 67. So I'm not so sure that wasn't a bad idea. Anyway, thank you very much.
So please join me in thanking Victor. If you don't have a copy of the book, we hope you'll get one, and thank you for coming to Hoover today.